Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here. Our topic for today is the paradox of humble leadership. So to start, humility has a complicated story. It is seen as an important, even fundamental virtue in both the Old and New Testament, but many modern philosophers see it as a vice rather than a virtue. Some of those philosophers say healthy humility is useless at best, while others say humility stands in the way of people fighting for their rights. To add to the difficulty about humility, it is a hard virtue to describe. Some people say humility is merely an accurate self-view, which would include accounting for both strengths and weaknesses. Others say we must pay attention to the fact that humility refers to lowliness. And still others, to include the author C.S. Lewis, say that the essence of humility is self-forgetfulness. And even if you can describe it, it can be even more difficult to develop. St. Augustine relates how slippery a virtue humility can be when he observes that as soon as he recognizes his humility, he starts to get proud of it. Benjamin Franklin relates in his autobiography how he devised a systematic approach to practice the virtues. He showed it to his friends who pointed out that he forgot to put humility on the list, so Franklin added it. Reflecting on his effort to be virtuous years later, Franklin noted that the one virtue he never made any progress with was humility. I give Franklin credit for being honest and would offer that his thought may reflect the reality of original sin. Christ tells us to love God and neighbor, but our sinful nature pushes us to love ourselves first and foremost. Given the complexity, I would like to do two things in our discussion, which are to provide a clear understanding of humility and then comment on the importance of humility to the leadership of Jesus and the nature of leadership itself. Lewis's comment on the self-forgetfulness of the humble person is pointing us in the right direction. One of the saints that has been most eloquent on the virtue of humility is St. Augustine. For Augustine, the best way to understand humility is to examine pride as its opposite. The sin of pride is the disordered love of self that displaces all other loves, up to and including love for God. The antidote for that disordered love is a turning away from the self to love God and others more than oneself. So for St. Augustine, humility is a form of love understood as a genuine concern for others. This is the foundation of Lewis's idea that humility is a form of self-forgetfulness. As followers of Christ, we cannot remain only at this level, however. We must acknowledge that the idea of humility includes an aspect of lowliness. As St. Paul tells us in his letter to the Philippians, the humility of Christ is unsurpassed because he did not grasp at divinity, but lowered himself. The Greek word in the passage is kenosis, which means self-emptying. He emptied himself and took the form of a slave that was crucified. The unprecedented revelation communicated in the New Testament is the reality that the infinite, transcendent, all-knowing, and all-powerful God is himself humble. And St. Paul's famous hymn in the letter to the Philippians also points to the paradoxical relationship between humility and leadership. Because Christ humbled himself, he has been exalted. His is the name that is above every other name, and at his name every knee must bend. The paradox is evident in the Gospel of John as well. At the climax of Jesus' public ministry, St. John tells us that Jesus, being fully aware that the Father had put everything into his power, turns to his disciples and washes their feet. The all-powerful Christ lowers himself, again, to take the role of a servant and washes the feet of 12 poor, undistinguished men. Scripture is providing us extraordinary insight into the nature of leadership and even sheds light on God's method in the Incarnation. God must save humanity from sin and death, and does so by becoming human himself. The transcendent, almighty second person of the Holy Trinity becomes a finite human, even an infant. He does so to lead humanity back to the Father. Since love is always a free act, God must lead humans to himself rather than coerce them. And to do so, he becomes one of us so he can show us the way to the Father. The letter to the Hebrews tells us that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has similarly been tested in every way, yet without sin. It is not only the transcendent second person of the Holy Trinity that leads us back to the Father, but the human person, Jesus Christ, who is able to understand our weakness because he has taken on our frailty himself. The lesson is that even though leaders will usually have a higher status than their followers, they must be able to transcend that difference and authentically relate to their followers if they are to effectively lead them. It is through humility that a leader can establish an authentic relationship with his or her followers, which is fundamental to a leader's ability to inspire a follower. And the great paradox of humility and leadership is the fact that the leader who is able to humbly relate to his or her followers, humbly provide the example those followers need to accomplish their mission, will be glorified because of the willingness to be humble. It is simply a fact that effective leaders garner much attention and admiration. And here's the tricky part. The interior motivation of humble leadership cannot be glory. Humble leadership must be motivated by love. If the motivation of Jesus to humble himself was to achieve the goal of exaltation, if he died on the cross so he could have the name above every other name, no one would follow him. Christ's humility had to be oriented toward the good of others. As St. Augustine tells us, Christ's humility had to be a form of love to attract followers, and so must ours. The authentically humble leader is also a leader of love, and that combination of virtues will have an extraordinary effect on any group of followers.